The man at the center of the mystery. The Nevada desert stretches out in every direction, endless, silent, and filled with secrets. Hidden beyond forgotten dirt paths and secured by barbed wire begins the strange and haunting tale of Bob Lazar. Robert Scott Lazar was not always a well-known name in UFO communities. For much of his early life, he preferred to remain unnoticed. Born on January 26, 1959 and raised in Coral Gables, Florida, he grew up fascinated by machines and technology. A natural tinkerer, Bob found himself drawn to anything mechanical: rocket engines, electronics, lasers. If it sparked, glowed, or exploded, it captured his attention. By the early 1980s, Bob had moved west and eventually settled in Las Vegas. There, he claimed to have worked as a physicist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, taking part in classified research. The official records from Los Alamos are unclear. Some argue he was never there, while others insist he worked under subcontract. What is certain is this: Lazar would soon become the focus of one of the most controversial UFO claims in history. In 1989, he came forward publicly, appearing on Las Vegas television under the alias Dennis, his face hidden in shadow. Lazar delivered a shocking statement. He revealed that he had worked on alien spacecraft at a facility known as S4, a secret installation close to the infamous Area 51. According to Lazar, the U.S. government possessed 9 extraterrestrial crafts, 9 flying saucers of unknown design, hidden within hangars carved directly into the mountainside of S4. His assignment, he explained, was to help reverse engineer the propulsion system of one of these vehicles. This propulsion system, Lazar claimed, was unlike anything understood by modern science. It was powered by a mysterious substance called Element 115, an isotope unknown on Earth. He explained that this element generated gravity waves, bending space-time itself, allowing the craft to move instantly from one point to another. To viewers, Lazar appeared calm and direct, not like a dreamer spinning tales, but as a reluctant insider revealing what he knew. He spoke with precision, describing the craft's design, the base's layout, and even the level of his security clearance. He also mentioned biometric hand scanners, long before such devices became common technology. Skeptics, however, quickly attacked his story. His supposed educational records from Caltech and MIT were missing. No diplomas, no student lists, no yearbooks, nothing showed his name. Lazar argued that the government had erased his past to discredit him. Whether cover-up or fabrication, the uncertainty only fueled the mystery. Even more unsettling were the details he gave about S4 itself. The base, he said, was hidden south of Groom Lake, near Papoose Lake, built directly into the mountains. Each saucer was housed in its own hangar, with massive bay doors disguised to match the surrounding rock. The craft Lazar worked on, he described, had a metallic, liquid-like surface, smooth, cold, and seamless, yet strangely inviting. He said he was required to read briefings that claimed the beings behind these ships came from the Zeta Reticuli star system, located more than 39 light-years away. According to these classified briefings, the U.S. government had been in possession of alien technology since the late 1940s. Some argue Lazar fabricated his story for attention, while others suspect he was used in a calculated disinformation effort. Yet one thing remains undeniable. His testimony reignited worldwide curiosity about Area 51 and kept speculation alive for decades. Lazar spoke with such precise technical detail that dismissing him outright wasn't easy. And over time, certain elements of his claims, like the existence of a hidden facility near Papoose Lake, found quiet support through satellite images and independent investigations. But who exactly was Bob Lazar? Was he a scientist turned reluctant whistleblower, a man burdened with secrets he could no longer keep? Or was he something entirely different? As this mystery deepens, we follow Lazar further into the Nevada desert, past checkpoints, under surveillance cameras, and into the shadows of S4, a place where the extraordinary might just prove to be real. The path to S4, Lazar said, was like entering another world. After undergoing extensive background checks, polygraph tests, and gaining high-level security clearances, he was transported in a bus with blacked-out windows from the edges of Groom Lake to the hidden base. The route was concealed. Only those already familiar with it knew where they were going. Lazar recalled the moment he first saw the hangars. They looked like part of the mountain, he said, camouflaged and flawless, as though the desert landscape had been sculpted to hide them. The massive doors opened in silence, revealing a sight that would alter his life forever. Inside were 9 different crafts, each unique in size and design. Some resembled the classic image of a flying saucer, while others had angular or organic shapes that defied all known engineering. The one Lazar was assigned to study, he nicknamed the sport model. It was compact, sleek, and metallic, shimmering faintly as though bending the light around it. Resting on its own landing gear at the center of the hangar, it bore no visible seams, bolts, or rivets, nothing resembling conventional human construction. The first time he was allowed near it, Lazar reached out and touched its surface. It felt cold and smooth, like brushed steel, though strangely lightweight. His instructions were simple: observe, but do not tamper. His primary mission was to reverse engineer the propulsion system, to understand its workings without being told where it truly came from. Inside, the craft was just as baffling. The proportions felt off. Ceilings were low, chairs were small, seemingly built for beings perhaps 3 to 4 feet tall. The interior had no switches, no wiring, no visible control systems. Instead, it was bare and minimalistic, with curved walls and a single column rising from floor to ceiling at the very center. That central column, Lazar was told, functioned as the reactor. At the core of its propulsion was what he described as a gravity amplifier. According to him, the craft contained 3 of these amplifiers, arranged in a triangular formation beneath the floor. These devices emitted gravitational waves that could be steered and focused. This wasn't propulsion in the way we understand it. It wasn't thrust. It was distortion. By bending the very fabric of space-time, the craft didn't so much fly as it fell forward into distorted space. It compressed the area ahead of it, expanded the space behind, and in doing so, could shift instantly from one location to another. No engines, no exhaust, just a smooth, soundless glide. The source of this manipulation, Lazar explained, was a reactor powered by element 115. At the time, the element did not exist on the periodic table. It had never been synthesized in any lab. Yet, Lazar claimed the version within the reactor was stable, generating immense energy without cooling systems or harmful radiation. According to him, the process worked like this. Element 115 was bombarded inside the reactor, releasing a form of anti-gravitational energy. That energy was then channeled through waveguides into the 3 gravity amplifiers, which projected it outward. The entire system, Lazar said, was far beyond anything human science had even begun to imagine. Still, he admitted he never fully understood it. The program was tightly compartmentalized. He wasn't permitted to speak with those studying the craft's metallurgy, nor the ones analyzing its control mechanisms. Each team had its own narrow assignment. Nobody saw the whole picture. This deliberate isolation fostered a climate of mistrust. The facility itself, Lazar recalled, felt heavy with paranoia. Armed guards patrolled the corridors. Conversations were monitored. Workers were constantly reminded never to discuss their duties off-site. Any violation meant immediate dismissal, or worse. On one occasion, Lazar claimed, he was allowed to witness a live demonstration. The sport model rose gently from the ground, hovered weightlessly, and then darted off at an impossible angle. Its motion was fluid, almost organic, like a leaf drifting on water, untethered by inertia. There was no roar, no mechanical noise, just a low vibration that resonated in the chest, like the hum of some distant engine. Watching it in flight, Lazar became convinced. This was no experimental aircraft stolen from an enemy nation. This was something foreign, something not of this earth. In the weeks that followed, his technical knowledge expanded, but so did his fear. He began to notice surveillance beyond the base, helicopters lingering above his home, cars with darkened windows stationed near his street. Even casual conversations with his wife felt dangerous, and so he made a reckless choice. He brought friends out into the desert to witness what he had seen. Bob Lazar knew full well he was crossing a line, violating the strict secrecy of his clearance. Lazar understood that if he was caught, the outcome could be disastrous. Yet fear and curiosity pushed him forward. He had witnessed something extraordinary, something he could no longer keep to himself. One night he gathered a few companions, among them his friend, physicist Gene Huff, and his then-wife Carol. They met outside Las Vegas and drove deep into the Nevada desert. Their destination was a vantage point overlooking Papoose Lake, just south of Groom Lake, where Lazar claimed test flights of alien craft took place. He had chosen a Wednesday for a reason. According to him, flights were scheduled mid-week, under cover of night, when the chance of being spotted was slim. Armed with camcorders and binoculars, they positioned themselves in the darkness and waited. Then it appeared. A radiant orb rose silently above the mountains. It hovered, motionless at first, before darting at sharp, impossible angles, up, sideways, down, exactly as Lazar had described. The movement defied conventional aircraft. It was fluid, seamless, without the drag of inertia. The group was awestruck. They recorded what they could, though the footage was shaky, only small glowing lights against the black sky. Still, for them, it was undeniable proof. Lazar had been telling the truth, but their secret outing soon drew attention. On a later trip, the group was intercepted. Out of the darkness, armed military personnel emerged, detaining them immediately. Their identities were taken, their cameras confiscated. Lazar himself was pulled aside for questioning. There, he was confronted with transcripts of his own phone calls, evidence his conversations were under surveillance. He was issued a chilling warning: never return. The message was unmistakable. His time with S4 was finished, yet the pressure didn't end. He was followed, harassed, and threatened. The more they tried to silence him, the more he felt compelled to speak. And so, Lazar made a bold decision. If they intended to bury the truth, he would reveal it first, openly and publicly. That was when he contacted George Knapp, an investigative reporter with Las Vegas station KLAS. Knapp had a reputation for tackling unconventional stories, but nothing prepared him for Lazar's account. In a broadcast that would ignite worldwide attention, Lazar appeared with his identity concealed, his face in shadow, his voice distorted. He laid everything out. S4, the alien craft, the gravity propulsion systems, Element 115, and the strict compartmentalization of the program. Almost overnight, Area 51 became a household name. The interview spread like wildfire. UFO enthusiasts hailed Lazar as a courageous whistleblower. Skeptics dismissed him as a fraud. But one fact was undeniable. The conversation had shifted. People who had never even heard of S4 or Groom Lake were suddenly demanding answers. In the months that followed, Lazar continued giving interviews, fanning the flames of a debate that refused to die down. With his identity finally revealed, Lazar spoke with a steady calm, rarely faltering in his details. While some of his claims were impossible to prove, others gradually began to find support. One striking example was the hand scanner he described at S4, a device that verified personnel by measuring the length of the bones in their hands. At the time, the idea seemed outlandish, almost science fiction, yet years later, photographs surfaced of an identical biometric device used in classified military installations. For Lazar, it was a small but powerful vindication. Then came the question of element 115. When Lazar first mentioned it in 1989, no such element existed on the periodic table. But in 2003, scientists in Russia and the United States synthesized moscovium, atomic number 115. Although it was highly unstable, decaying in mere milliseconds, Lazar maintained that the extraterrestrial craft utilized a stable isotope, something beyond our current capabilities. Whether coincidence or confirmation, the discovery breathed new life into his story. Despite the growing attention, Lazar never seemed eager to embrace fame. He stepped away from the spotlight, opening a small business where he built and sold scientific equipment. He declined most interview requests, citing safety concerns and the heavy toll his revelations had taken on his personal life. For decades, he remained quiet. Yet the legend of S4 only grew louder. Researchers, journalists, and filmmakers continued to dig deeper. And in the lonely stretches of Nevada's desert, whispers persisted, secrets buried beneath mountains, and of the man who claimed to have glimpsed them. But Lazar had not only spoken, he had taken others with him into the desert. On one such night, he and a small group met outside Las Vegas before driving toward the Nevada test site, just miles from the edge of restricted airspace. Lazar knew the schedule. He insisted test flights happen midweek, under the cover of darkness. They parked along a dirt trail overlooking Groom Lake, armed with telescopes, cameras, and night vision gear. Nervous but excited, they waited. And then it appeared. High above the desert, a glowing sphere materialized. It hovered, pulsed, then shot across the sky at speeds beyond any aircraft known to man. It stopped on a dime, shifted direction instantly, and vanished in a blink, performing maneuvers that defied every law of physics. Lazar turned to his companions and whispered, "That's it. That's the sports model." The group sat breathless as the mysterious light returned again and again, gliding silently through the night. Over the next 2 weeks they returned twice more, each time witnessing the same impossible display, gravity-defying, soundless movement. But on the third trip, everything changed. Just minutes after setting up their equipment, Lazar caught sight of a faint shimmer on the horizon. A vehicle appeared, then another. Within moments, the desert was flooded with harsh spotlights. Government security had arrived. The group was swiftly detained. IDs were collected, film was seized, and pointed questions were asked. No arrests were made, but the warning was undeniable. Stop watching. Lazar had pushed too far. The very next day, he was summoned back to S4. His badge no longer opened the doors. Instead, he was escorted into a small interrogation room where officials laid transcripts of his private phone calls in front of him. Every word, every conversation had been monitored. They accused him of breaching national security, of putting lives at risk. The message was delivered with chilling clarity. If he spoke to anyone again, even in whispers, there would be consequences. Anger mixed with fear. Lazar realized he had become a liability. Staying silent might not protect him, it might erase him. Desperate, he made a bold decision. He contacted investigative journalist George Knapp at KLAS in Las Vegas. At first, he concealed his identity, appearing under the alias Dennis. But soon, he stepped into the light. In May 1989, the interview aired, and it sent shockwaves across the world. Calm, articulate, and seemingly credible, Lazar described saucers hidden in the Nevada desert, gravity-based propulsion systems, and a mysterious fuel, element 115. The reaction was immediate. UFO researchers hailed him as a whistleblower. Skeptics tore into his claims. But his name was now forever entwined with Area 51 lore. The fallout was brutal. Lazar said his life was turned upside down. Threats poured in. Reporters crowded his home. Friends distanced themselves. His professional and personal reputation took relentless hits. Yet he never recanted. Critics pointed to holes in his background. His academic credentials couldn't be verified. His employment history at Los Alamos was disputed. To many, this was proof of fabrication, but Lazar remained firm. He insisted the truth had been buried and he had nothing to gain by fabricating it. Over the years, some of his claims found surprising echoes. The hand scanner he described in the late 80s, once dismissed as fantasy, was later revealed to be real military technology. And in 2003, scientists synthesized element 115, albeit in unstable forms. Still, Lazar insisted the isotope used in the craft was stable, something beyond our reach. He never returned to S4. Instead, he retreated from the spotlight, running a small scientific equipment business. But the shadow of what he had witnessed never left him. For believers, he had already said enough. Enough to suggest humanity was not alone. Enough to force the world to wonder what secrets still lay buried beneath Nevada's desert. When Bob Lazar went public in 1989, he expected skepticism. What he didn't foresee was how thoroughly his life would be dismantled. Journalists, investigators, and government officials tore into every detail, determined to expose him as a fraud. They questioned everything. The first line of attack came against Lazar's education. He had claimed degrees from both the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the California Institute of Technology. Yet when investigators went looking, they found nothing. No transcripts, no student records, no yearbook photos, no registry entries. It was as if he had never studied there at all. Lazar countered by insisting his records had been deliberately erased in an orchestrated government effort to destroy his credibility. He pointed to something else as proof: the disappearance of his employment records at Los Alamos National Laboratory. But there were traces, small breadcrumbs. A 1982 Los Alamos phone directory listed him as a technician, and a local newspaper article even showed him working with particle accelerators. Evidence, perhaps, that he had indeed been engaged in scientific work. Still, skeptics weren't convinced. They argued that Lazar may have been at Los Alamos, but only in a limited technical capacity, not as a physicist. That he may have attended community college, but not MIT. Piece by piece, his narrative was being chipped away. Then came legal trouble. In the early 1990s, Lazar was arrested for involvement in a prostitution operation. The charge had no connection to UFOs, but it damaged his reputation nonetheless. To many in the public, the man claiming alien secrets was now just another criminal. For some, it was the final nail in the coffin. But others saw it differently. They argued Lazar was being targeted, punished, and discredited for daring to speak out. His run-ins with the law, they believed, were not coincidences but part of a calculated campaign to ruin him. To them, he wasn't a liar. He was a truth-teller under attack. As years went by, Lazar receded into the background. He settled in Michigan for a time, then moved back to Nevada, running United Nuclear, a small scientific supply company. He rarely granted interviews, and when he did, his story never shifted. In one conversation, he explained it plainly. "I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm not writing a book. I'm not going on a speaking tour. I'm just telling you what I saw, what I worked on, what I know." There was a striking sincerity in his delivery. Calm, steady, unwavering. For believers, that calmness was proof of authenticity. For doubters, it was simply the polished performance of a man repeating the same script for decades. Nearly 30 years after his explosive 1989 interview, Lazar reappeared in 2018 through Jeremy Corbell's documentary Bob Lazar, Area 51 and Flying Saucers. The film reignited debate, introducing Lazar's claims to a new generation. It didn't present fresh evidence, but it did reveal something else. A man profoundly shaped by what he said he had witnessed. On screen, Lazar appeared cautious, weary, and deeply private, a reluctant figure who had carried an extraordinary burden for most of his life. Filmmaker Jeremy Corbell described Bob Lazar as the reluctant whistleblower, a man not chasing the spotlight but carrying the weight of knowledge he could never put down. In the documentary, Lazar recalled one of the most unsettling nights of his life. He awoke to the sound of footsteps outside. Through the window, he caught sight of a dark vehicle parked on the street. Moments later, the power in his home abruptly cut out. Whether it was coincidence, paranoia, or deliberate intimidation, he never discovered the truth. His wife, Joy, spoke of the constant strain they lived under, the clicks on their phone line, the sensation of being monitored, the quiet dread of unseen eyes. For them, life had become a shadow war, not fought with weapons, but with fear. Yet despite it all, Lazar maintained he had no regrets. In his words, "If I could go back, I probably wouldn't change anything. I didn't ask for this, but I won't lie about what I saw." That single line would echo for decades, repeated across forums, documentaries, and debates in the UFO community. By this point, Lazar's account had transcended testimony and become legend. To believers, he was the man who cracked open the door to the hidden world of black-budget alien research. To skeptics, he was a skilled fabricator with just enough technical jargon to make his story convincing. But maybe the real question isn't whether Lazar was telling the truth. Perhaps the real mystery is why his story has endured so powerfully for so long. Maybe it's because his tale speaks to something deep within us, our need to know what lies beyond, our hope that we are not alone, and our fear that the answers are being deliberately kept from us. And in the stillness of the Nevada desert, under endless stars, that hope and fear blur into one. As Lazar's story seeped into popular culture, curiosity turned toward the science behind his claims. Could any of it be real? Was the technology he described even remotely possible within the boundaries of known physics? The centerpiece of his account was an alien reactor, no larger than a basketball, capable of generating its own gravitational field. According to Lazar, it required no conventional fuel, produced no exhaust, no heat, and no sound. At the core of this device was element 115. In 1989, it existed only as a theoretical entry on the periodic table, nestled within the so-called island of stability. Lazar claimed this exotic element fueled the craft's gravity amplifiers, spherical devices that bent space-time itself, allowing the saucer to jump between points in space. The reactor, he explained, generated a gravitational distortion, like a lens-curving reality. Instead of propelling itself forward, the craft manipulated the very fabric of space. It didn't fly. It fell through space. The implications were staggering. Lazar described demonstrations at S4 where the craft hovered effortlessly. When activated, it produced a deep, resonant hum and a faint glow, unlike anything he had ever seen. According to Lazar, the craft could only be operated by select humans, individuals whose neurological wiring aligned with its interface. Piloting it, he claimed, was as much a mental connection as it was a physical one. Unlike conventional propulsion, no combustion, no magnetism, the system was entirely gravity-based, an idea that still sits at the edge of impossibility in modern physics. Yet Lazar insisted he had seen it in action. In 2003, Russian scientists successfully synthesized a new element, moscovium, with atomic number 115. But it was unstable, collapsing in milliseconds. For skeptics, this was the nail in the coffin. Proof, they argued, that Lazar had invented his story. A stable isotope of 115 simply could not exist, but Lazar countered. The version he worked with, he claimed, wasn't of this Earth. It was a stable isotope, either artificially manufactured by an advanced intelligence or originating from a distant star system, something beyond our reach. Still, Lazar was quick to admit his own limitations. He didn't fully understand the technology. His work at S4 was reverse engineering, deciphering mechanisms that defied human comprehension. In his words, it was like handing a motorcycle to a blacksmith from the 1800s. The gravity amplifiers, he explained, could bend light itself, rendering the craft nearly invisible when powered up. During one test, he watched as the saucer lifted silently off the ground, tilted on its edge, and accelerated instantaneously. No drag, no inertia. It was as if the ship had decoupled from Earth's gravity altogether. Strangest of all was its flight pattern. The craft didn't fly nose first, it flew belly first. With the amplifiers mounted underneath, they projected forward, pulling the craft into its destination. The ship wasn't flying, it was falling, guided by gravity itself. If true, this technology shattered every known law of aerodynamics. It would make combustion engines, rockets, even fossil fuels obsolete. And if scalable, it could open the door to interstellar travel. But gravity isn't a force humanity has ever controlled. Despite Einstein's breakthroughs and decades of study on gravitational waves, no one has ever created a usable gravity field. Lazar's testimony stood alone, unsupported, yet compelling. In interviews, he spoke with quiet certainty. He sketched diagrams of amplifiers, reactors, and waveguides. He described how the field warped not only space, but time itself, slowing it within the bubble of distortion. Inside the craft, he said, clocks would tick differently than outside. To skeptics, it was technobabble, an elaborate weave of jargon to hide the lack of proof. But to others, his tone suggested something else. He didn't sound like a salesman or a showman. He sounded like a man who had seen something extraordinary, someone humbled, even haunted by alien technology. For some, Lazar's science was nonsense. For others, it was a spark. Engineers, tinkerers, and fringe physicists began chasing the edges of possibility, experimenting with inertial dampeners, gravity shields, and exotic matter. Most of it went nowhere, but the idea had been planted, and like a stubborn seed, it lingered, quietly, steadily, growing in the imaginations of those convinced humanity had only begun to glimpse what was possible. The fallout from Lazar's claims didn't explode in a single moment. It spread like ripples in still water, reaching government halls, research labs, conspiracy forums, and the airwaves of late-night radio. The first ripple came from the media. At first, Lazar was treated as a curiosity, a quirky whistleblower with a wild tale. But as national attention grew, so did the scrutiny. Headlines framed him as either a delusional dreamer or an opportunist chasing fame. His lack of proof made it easy to dismiss. And yet, there were cracks in the dismissal. A handful of reporters noticed odd patterns, colleagues who refused to speak on record, documents that seemed to vanish, and security details Lazar cited with uncanny precision. These weren't random guesses. They hinted at insider knowledge. Then came the scientific community. For most physicists and engineers, Lazar's claims were impossible. Gravity manipulation, faster than light travel, out of the question. But a smaller circle of academics reacted differently, not with belief, but with curiosity. They noted how some of Lazar's descriptions mirrored legitimate, if highly theoretical, concepts: wormholes, space-time curvature, gravitational lensing. These weren't science fiction. They were real areas of advanced physics. And though Lazar's credentials were unverifiable, he spoke their language in ways that were difficult to ignore. No official confirmation ever came, but there was no outright denial either. In the murky world of classified projects, silence itself can feel like an answer. Then, in 2017, almost 3 decades after Lazar first spoke out, the New York Times dropped a revelation. The Pentagon had secretly funded a UFO research initiative known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP. Overnight, Lazar's story didn't seem so outlandish. Released by the Department of Defense, cockpit footage showed Navy pilots encountering strange objects, craft accelerating in impossible bursts, maneuvering without visible engines, ignoring the very rules of inertia. To many, they looked eerily like the technology Lazar had described years before. Public interest exploded. UFOs, now reframed as UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, shifted from fringe fascination to mainstream debate. Universities, journalists, even lawmakers began asking questions once considered untouchable. And quietly, in the background, Bob Lazar's name returned to the spotlight. Podcasts, documentaries, Reddit threads, YouTube channels. The debate roared back to life. Was Lazar the first whistleblower, or just a lucky fraud who guessed right? In 2018, filmmaker Jeremy Corbell reintroduced Lazar to the world. His documentary gave younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, their first real glimpse of the man. He didn't look like a showman. He looked tired, worn down, yet calm. At a desk cluttered with papers, he spoke with a quiet conviction that felt more like a burden than a boast. And then came the near confirmations. Former Pentagon insiders, people like Luis Elizondo and Christopher Mellon, publicly hinted that the U.S. government did, in fact, possess materials of unknown origin. They stopped short of endorsing Lazar outright, but their words edged close enough to keep his claims alive. Over the years, Lazar's public image evolved. At first, he was dismissed as a crank. Later, he became a cult icon. And now, he lingers as something more elusive, an enduring mystery, neither fully discredited nor fully vindicated, but suspended in a gray space, like a riddle without an answer. What made him even harder to dismiss was his refusal to exploit the fame. He didn't tour. He didn't sell merchandise. He ran a small chemistry supply shop. He stayed off social media. When asked why he never cashed in, Lazar would shrug and say, "I don't care if you believe me. I never did this for attention." For some, that restraint made his story more believable. After all, the truth doesn't always shout. Sometimes it only needs to be whispered once, and it echoes forever. As Lazar's name faded from headlines, his life never truly returned to normal. In UFO circles, however, Lazar wasn't just credible, he was canon. Conferences echoed his testimony. Hobbyists drafted floor plans of S4. Amateur modelers recreated his gravity amplifiers in 3D. His story became the missing key, the framework tying together decades of UFO lore. Roswell? Perhaps one of the 9 crafts. Rendlesham? Maybe reverse-engineered tech. The Navy's Tic Tac sightings? Almost identical to the propulsion system Lazar described. His narrative stitched the scattered pieces of UFO history into a single tapestry. Even within government walls, the ripples reached further than many expected. Behind closed doors, intelligence officials were quietly pressed with questions. Had they heard of Lazar? Was there any truth to his claims? Could the United States really be hiding technology not of this world? In truth, Lazar's life never returned to what it once was. From the moment he stepped forward, he was marked, not in the Hollywood sense of assassins lurking in shadows, but in the quieter, more insidious way that a person's existence is permanently altered. He tried to move on. He founded United Nuclear, a scientific supply company. On the surface, it was ordinary: chemicals, lab glassware, high-voltage equipment, nothing extraordinary. But even this pursuit seemed shadowed. His business drew constant inspections. Shipments were delayed. Packages arrived and opened. To some, it looked like routine bureaucracy. To others, it felt like a subtle campaign to keep him off balance. Lazar rarely complained, but people close to him noticed. He was no longer the fiery whistleblower of 1989, trembling as he revealed the secrets of S4. His voice had shifted, calmer now, deliberate, sometimes burdened. In interviews, he weighed every word as though each carried a price. When asked if he regretted speaking out, he often paused. Then, with a half smile, he would admit, it wasn't worth it. Not because his story was false, but because of what it cost him: harassment, ridicule, the erosion of his reputation. Friends drifted away. His family endured the same shadows: unmarked cars outside, unexplained phone interference, the unshakable sense of being monitored. It didn't break them, but it never really left them either. He had cracked a door open, and no matter how much he wished otherwise, it could never be closed. Yet through it all, Lazar never retracted his testimony. Not once. He never sought to monetize it with books, convention tours, or speaking circuits. His interviews were rare, reluctant, often given at someone else's urging. In one particularly quiet exchange, he was asked whether he still feared for his life. Lazar thought for a long moment. Then he answered, "Not anymore." At first, yes. But eventually, you realize you're just a small piece in a very large puzzle. They don't need to eliminate you. They only need to discredit you. It was a sobering truth, spoken in the same flat, matter-of-fact tone he used when discussing physics. He mentioned the strange interruptions almost casually: phones clicking, computers glitching, helicopters hovering low over his home at night. Maybe coincidences, maybe not. He never speculated. He just described. For decades, Lazar avoided the UFO spotlight, until in 2018, filmmaker Jeremy Corbell persuaded him to appear in a documentary. Lazar resisted at first, but finally agreed, on one condition: it could not be sensationalized. It had to remain quiet, personal, grounded. When the film premiered in Los Angeles, the theater was filled to capacity. A strange mix of scientists, skeptics, conspiracy theorists, and true believers. When Lazar finally stepped onto the stage for the Q&A, he looked uneasy. His hands trembled slightly. His eyes stayed low. This was not a man chasing fame. This was a man who had never truly escaped the weight of what he revealed. When Lazar finally spoke, the room fell silent. There were no shocking disclosures, no hidden bombshells. Just the same story he had carried for more than 30 years, the same facility at S4, the same saucers, the same reactor that shouldn't exist. Yet the familiarity of his words gave them weight. He wasn't embellishing. He wasn't evolving the tale. He was simply refusing to let it vanish. Over time, Lazar shifted from a controversial whistleblower into something larger, a permanent fixture in UFO lore. He wasn't just the man who claimed to have seen alien technology. He became the man who never wavered. And in a world filled with shifting narratives and fleeting conspiracies, that consistency became his quiet badge of honor. People traveled across the country to find him, not for laboratory supplies, but to stand before him, to shake his hand, to say they believed. Some wept, others were simply struck silent. Lazar, for his part, never seemed sure what to do with their devotion. He'd nod politely, murmur a soft, "thank you," and then return to the simple tasks of his shop, measuring powders, labeling bottles, preparing shipments. A life of unremarkable routine, shadowed by extraordinary history. But every so often, someone would ask the question that lingered above all others. "Do you still think about S4?" And Lazar, without hesitation, would answer, "Every day." There was never a doubt. As the years passed and decades slipped by, Lazar's story began to sound less like a controversy and more like a legend, not because it was folklore, but because it endured. Like all myths that survive, it lingered through repetition. The same words, the same imagery, the same calm conviction in his voice. There was no need for reinvention, no shifting details. What Lazar claimed to have seen at S4 was carved into his memory like a scar left by fire. He could not forget, and he would not, because forgetting would mean burying something that was never meant to stay hidden. And then, strangely, the world began to catch up. By the early 2020s, the stigma surrounding UFOs, or UAPs, had begun to collapse. Declassified military videos circulated. Former officials testified under oath. Even NASA announced new efforts to study the phenomenon. The silence that had once suffocated the subject was breaking apart. From the sidelines, Lazar watched. He wasn't demanding recognition. He wasn't asking for vindication. But he couldn't help noticing how much of the modern discourse mirrored the words he had spoken in 1989. Craft without engines, objects with no heat signature, movements that mocked the laws of physics, echoes, clear, unmistakable. And then came a moment that froze the conversation in place. Behind closed doors, during a congressional briefing, a high-ranking intelligence official was asked the unthinkable. Had the United States recovered craft not made by human hands? The official response never reached the public. But rumors slipped through the cracks. Whispers claimed the answer had been a single word, yes. For those who had followed Lazar's testimony, that one syllable felt seismic. Not outright confirmation, but close enough. A loose thread tugging at decades of secrecy. If the government truly possessed such craft, then Lazar's story was no longer fantasy. At the very least, part of it had always been true. Online, his legend surged. Communities formed across Reddit forums, Discord channels, and YouTube documentaries. Every word he'd ever spoken was dissected, every detail examined. To newcomers, the most striking thing was his delivery. Lazar didn't sound like a hoaxer chasing attention. He spoke with the cadence of a man haunted by something he wished he hadn't seen. And more telling than anything, he never asked for compensation. No fame, no fortune, no control, only space to speak. That silence, that refusal to cash in, was rare. Others tried to extend his legacy. Independent researchers scoured the Nevada desert, searching for the hidden entrance to S4. Satellite images were poured over, terrain compared to Lazar's hand-drawn maps. But the evidence never surfaced. If the facility had existed, It had either been scrubbed clean or buried deeper still. Lazar himself never returned. When asked why, he would shake his head. I wouldn't get close. Not again. The base, he explained, wasn't guarded by fences alone. It was layered in secrecy, deterrence, and unseen forces, both physical and psychological. Still, fragments of that past clung to him. He remembered the cavernous hangars, the dim glow of the craft when powered on, the eerie shimmer of light bending around the gravity amplifier. They weren't just memories. They were anchors, tethers to the impossible. Inside his small shop, among shelves stacked with glassware and coiled wiring, he would sometimes sketch for curious visitors. Rough diagrams of the saucer, the three-reactor system, the mysterious fuel, always described the same way, never altered, never embellished. His testimony, preserved in ink. Even a few skeptics softened over time, not convinced, but unsettled. Because if Lazar had fabricated everything, his consistency over 30 years was uncanny. Consistency doesn't prove the truth, but it demands attention, and that's what set him apart. In an age of disinformation and spectacle, Lazar's story carried weight not because it shouted, but because it whispered. He never raised his voice, never inflated the tale. He simply repeated it, again and again, until it became impossible to ignore. Because at its heart, the Lazar story was never just about saucers or aliens. It was about secrecy, about what governments might do with knowledge too vast to comprehend, about the limits of science, and the quiet courage it takes to speak out. Whether you believe him or not, the story leaves a question that refuses to fade. What if he's telling the truth? And that question, whispered in the stillness of night, has echoed for more than 3 decades. Through desert winds, across radio waves, through endless digital conversations, into the mind of every curious soul who has ever looked up at the sky and wondered what waits beyond. As Bob Lazar moved into the later chapters of his life, he never fully disappeared, but he never chased the spotlight either. He seemed to exist in that strange boundary between myth and man, still alive, still running his small scientific supply shop, still carrying a story too extraordinary to ignore, yet too consistent to dismiss. His home was modest, shared with his wife, tucked quietly into an unassuming landscape. Nothing about it suggested fame or notoriety. Inside, alongside ordinary furniture and workbenches, were relics of another life: photographs, stacks of papers, worn physics texts, and notebooks filled with diagrams that few outside his circle could even recognize. Sometimes he would leaf through those notes, not like someone reliving old glories, but like a scientist still wrestling with a puzzle unsolved, trying, even decades later, to make sense of something that remained beyond human comprehension. There were no headlines now, no swarming cameras, just the occasional visitor who would ask in a hushed voice, "Do you still believe?" Lazar's reply never changed. He didn't frame it as belief. He framed it as memory. "It's not about belief," he would say. "It's about what I saw. And once you've seen it, you can't unsee it." The weight of that memory seemed to live in his posture, in the way his gaze would drift past the horizon as he thought aloud. Friends and colleagues who were willing to speak often remarked on his consistency. Through ridicule, through attacks, through endless skepticism, he never wavered. He didn't lash out at critics. He didn't adjust his testimony to fit new narratives. He simply remained the same man telling the same story. There is a quiet bravery in that, to carry a truth the world isn't ready to hear, and to endure the consequences without bitterness. Lazar never built a movement. He didn't form a cult. He didn't ask for loyalty, or money, or followers. All he ever asked was that people pay attention to the facts, and maybe hold a little patience. Still, the story never stayed buried. From time to time, waves of renewed attention crash back. Another documentary, another leaked report, another Navy pilot describing an impossible craft. Each time the world circled back to Lazar, and each time he met it with the same steady resignation, not excitement, not anger, just acceptance. But beneath that calm, there was something else. A sadness, not self-pity, but a kind of scientific mourning. Because what he had glimpsed at S4 wasn't just alien, it was elegant, a glimpse of a technology that could have changed everything. And yet, all of it had been hidden, buried in a dry desert hangar, locked away from the very minds that might have understood it. Lazar once remarked, "If we had even a partial grasp of how that propulsion worked, we could eliminate the energy crisis overnight." It wasn't an exaggeration. It was mathematics. If real, gravity manipulation would not only upend physics, it would revolutionize engineering, energy, and our very concept of what was possible. A new era of science, waiting just out of reach. But it remained sealed in secrecy. Lazar never spiraled into wild theories. He didn't speculate endlessly about who was behind it or why they kept it hidden. He stayed grounded, describing only what he saw, what he touched, what he could explain with precision. That restraint gave his story a peculiar honesty. He admitted what he didn't know and shared what he did. In private, he never stopped tinkering. Small experiments in his shop, magnetic fields, ion engines. Simple tests born from the same restless curiosity he had as a boy when he strapped jet engines to bicycles just to see if they'd fly. The wonder had never left him. It had only matured, turned inward. He rarely traveled. Most of his days unfolded within a short radius of home and shop. The storm of fame that once swirled around his name had long since passed. What remained was a quiet man, slightly out of step with the world, still carrying questions it hadn't yet caught up to. Visitors, when they came, were often startled by his simplicity. No shrine to UFOs, no alien posters, just shelves of chemicals, a dry wit, sharp eyes, and a lingering curiosity. A man who understood that truth does not always reward the teller. And yet, there were moments, rare, fleeting, when Lazar seemed almost at peace. He would stand outside at night, gaze at the stars, and say nothing at all. No theories, no explanations, just silence. As if in that silence lay the closest thing to understanding. In the quiet years, Bob Lazar became something unexpected, a symbol. Not the loud kind, not plastered on billboards or memed across the internet, but a quieter presence, enduring, unchanged. For the UFO community, Lazar was less a witness and more a compass, not necessarily the answer, but the question, a fixed point that reminded people of the strangeness hiding in plain sight. Because if even a fraction of his story was true, it meant humanity had already brushed against the impossible, and then turned its back on it. In those later years, Lazar gave few interviews. When he did, his words came slower, more deliberate. His hair had thinned, his face carried the weight of time, but the eyes remained unchanged. The same sharp eyes that once stared into the belly of a gravity-defying craft in the Nevada desert. Age could not erase that gaze. One evening during a rare interview, a journalist asked him a final question. "If you could go back, would you still speak out?" Lazar paused. A long silence. Then, with a faint nod, he said, "Yes. Because no matter what happened to me, the story is bigger than I am." That phrase lingered. Bigger than I am. It explained everything. The risk, the ridicule, the endless suspicion. Because when you witness something extraordinary, when you touch the unknown, you don't simply walk away. It stays with you, it shapes you, and eventually it demands to be told. Toward the end of his life, Lazar spoke of S4 only when pressed, not from fear, but with reverence, like someone guarding a sacred text. There was a weight in his words, yes, but also a strange beauty, an awe that never fully left him. He often admitted the hardest part wasn't the disbelief. It was knowing that what he had seen could change the world, and knowing it might never be allowed to. That ache gave his voice a softness, a quiet sorrow that never quite faded. At his final public appearance, a small science and consciousness symposium, Lazar didn't stand at the podium. He sat quietly in the back, just another guest. But people noticed. They gathered slowly, respectfully. No cameras, no shouting, just quiet handshakes, whispered thanks, and the weight of presence. When someone finally asked him what message he wanted to leave behind, Lazar didn't hesitate. "Don't stop asking questions," he said, "and don't assume the truth is what you're told it is. Sometimes it hides in the silence. That was Bob, Lazar's final gift, not because he refused to speak, but because he left space. Space for mystery, space for others to search, space for truth to breathe. In a world consumed by noise, he chose stillness, and in doing so, he became unforgettable. But the questions remained. And perhaps, in the end, that was what mattered most. Not the answers, not the proof, but the questions themselves. The reminder that the universe is vaster, stranger, and far more beautiful than we dare to admit. Bob Lazar was no prophet. He wasn't a martyr. He was simply a man who saw something he could never unsee. And instead of running from it, he chose to tell the world. That's rare. That's brave. And whether you accept his story or dismiss it, that courage alone is worth remembering. Because when you lie awake at night, eyes fixed on the ceiling or the stars, when you wonder if we're truly alone, if the sky hides machines moving through dimensions we can barely imagine, you'll think of Bob Lazar. And somewhere, in that thin space between thought and dream, you may hear a whisper. Gravity amplifiers. Element Stopitnashchi. Sport model. S4. And maybe, just maybe, that whisper will stay with you, the same way it stayed with him. Bob Lazar's story never truly ended. It simply dissolved into the collective subconscious, like a dream that lingers in the quiet of morning. Whether you believed every word or simply saw it as a reflection of our hunger for the stars, his testimony carved a permanent space in humanity's imagination. Years passed. Governments shifted. Classified files slipped through cracks. Fighter pilots came forward with reports of impossible craft. And each time the conversation returned to the question of extraterrestrial life, Lazar's name resurfaced. Not shouted, whispered. A reminder. He told us long ago. His legacy became something beyond evidence or theory. It became folklore, not in the sense of fantasy, but in the sense of endurance. A story carried quietly across generations, shared in late-night conversations, in hidden forums, in classrooms, and car rides under endless skies. Have you heard of Bob Lazar? And the younger ones, born long after his first interview, found themselves drawn in, not because he had the answers, but because he asked the right questions. What is gravity, really? Why do governments hide what they find? And if something not of this earth was ever recovered, what would it mean for everything we know? That's the power of the Lazar story. It isn't just about saucers or science. It's about perspective, about how fragile our understanding of reality might be, and how thin the line truly is between the ordinary and the impossible. For many who encountered his tale, belief wasn't the gift, change was. They didn't walk away certain. They walked away differently. Suddenly, The world felt bigger, more complex, and that sliver of doubt, what if he was right, never quite left them. That is the mark of a story with staying power. In the end, perhaps Bob Lazar wasn't just a scientist, a whistleblower, or a myth. Perhaps he was a mirror, a reflection of our deepest desire to know the unknown, to pull back the curtain, and to glimpse what lies beyond. And even if the view is brief and the image unclear, it still tells us something vital, that we are not done exploring. Late at night, if you sit in silence and think back to his story about sport model craft and gravity amplifiers, about an element beyond the periodic table, about a hangar carved into the Nevada earth, you may not find the answers, but you may feel something else: curiosity, wonder, and a sense of scale. Maybe Lazar's role was never to prove. Maybe it was to provoke, to awaken a question that cannot be silenced by skepticism alone, a question that keeps you looking up, even when there's nothing visible in the sky. In that way, his legacy remains airborne, suspended in the same space his story emerged from. Above the mountains, beyond the lights, between the known and the unknowable, it waits patiently for us to catch up. The desert is quiet now. The wind still moves across Groom Lake. The facility, if it ever existed, remains sealed behind fences and sand. But somewhere out there, beyond the dust and stars, something may still hover, silent, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it remembers the man who tried to speak for it. So, as you drift into sleep tonight, let the mystery settle around you. Let the silence speak. And let the story of Bob Lazar be a soft murmur in the darkness, a reminder that some truths hide not in what we know, but in what we dare to imagine.